The wooden rail cars shuddered to a halt, brakes screeching against metal tracks that had carried countless others before them into uncertainty. Inside, pressed shoulder to shoulder against splintered walls, young women clutched whatever remnants of their former lives they had managed to carry. A photograph creased and fading. A letter from home already months old. A small prayer book with pages soft from repeated handling. They had been travelling for days through a landscape that no longer resembled the country they remembered. Where proud cities once stood, only hollow shells remained, windows gaping like empty eye sockets staring at nothing. The skeletal frames of factories reached toward grey skies, their machinery silent, their workers scattered or dead. These were the Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had served the Third Reich in capacities that kept the war machine functioning. They had typed orders that sent men to battlefields. They had operated communications equipment that coordinated attacks. They had catalogued supplies, nursed wounded soldiers, and manned searchlights that swept the night sky for enemy bombers. Some had been enthusiastic believers in the cause they served. Others had simply followed orders because refusal meant consequences too terrible to contemplate. But now, with the Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, such distinctions no longer mattered. They were prisoners, defeated, captured by forces they had been taught to fear more than death itself. The propaganda had been relentless and specific. American soldiers, they were told repeatedly, were barbaric monsters who would show no mercy to German women. The images painted by Goebbels and his ministry were vivid and terrifying. Captivity would mean degradation beyond imagination. Starvation was the kindest fate they could hope for. More likely, they would face humiliation, assault, torture. Some whispered that the Americans would simply execute prisoners outright, disposing of the evidence in mass graves that would never be marked or mourned. Mothers pulled daughters aside before the end came, speaking in urgent, frightened whispers about what to expect if captured. It would be better to die, some said, than to fall into enemy hands. So when the rail cars finally stopped and the doors were pulled open by American soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, every woman inside braced herself for the worst. Some had already resolved to resist, to fight back even if it meant immediate death. Others had retreated into a numb acceptance, their minds already trying to distance themselves from whatever horrors were about to unfold. A few clutched concealed pills, cyanide capsules, or sleeping medications hoarded for this exact moment, preferring to choose their own end rather than suffer at the hands of the enemy. But the soldiers who appeared in the doorway did not drag them out roughly or shout crude insults. Instead, they simply gestured for the women to disembark, their voices neither warm nor cold, just professionally neutral. Names were called from lists. Documents were checked with bureaucratic precision. The women were counted, sorted into groups, and directed toward waiting transport vehicles. There were no beatings. No one was struck or shoved. The process was orderly, methodical, almost mundane in its efficiency. This absence of immediate violence was somehow more unsettling than cruelty would have been. At least cruelty would have confirmed what they expected, what they had been prepared for. This strange civility left them unmoored, uncertain what to believe. The journey to the ports took them through more devastated territory. Bremen had been beautiful once, a city of merchants and maritime tradition, its harbour filled with ships from around the world. Now it was a wasteland of collapsed buildings and twisted metal. The women pressed their faces to the windows of the trucks carrying them, watching civilians picking through ruins, children with faces old beyond their years searching for anything edible or salvageable. The guilt was immediate and crushing. These were their people, suffering unimaginable deprivation while they were being transported away to some unknown fate. How could they leave when so much remained broken? The ships waiting at the docks were massive, far larger than anything most of these women had ever seen. American transport vessels, their hulls painted in utilitarian grey, bobbed in water that reflected the overcast sky. Gangplanks extended upward at steep angles, and the women climbed them slowly, each step taking them further from everything they had ever known. Some paused at the top to look back one final time at the European coastline, trying to memorize the sight of home even in its ruined state. Others could not bear to look, keeping their eyes fixed on their feet as they shuffled forward into the ship's belly. Below deck, the accommodations were cramped but not inhumane. Metal bunks were stacked 3 high in holds that smelled of diesel fuel and salt water. The women were assigned spaces and given thin mattresses and blankets that were worn but clean. As the engines rumbled to life and the ship began to move, pulling away from the dock and out into open water, many experienced their first moments of complete despair. The finality of it settled over them like a shroud. They were leaving Europe, leaving Germany, leaving everything. Ahead lay only the unknown and the terrible certainty that they were sailing directly into the heart of enemy territory. The Atlantic crossing was long and brutal for those unaccustomed to the sea. Waves rose and fell in endless rhythm, causing the ship to pitch and roll. Seasickness swept through the prisoners like a plague, leaving them retching into buckets, too weak to stand, their bodies emptied of everything. The air below deck became thick and foul, heavy with the smell of vomit and unwashed bodies and diesel exhaust. Women lay in their bunks moaning, praying for the journey to end, for death, for anything other than this miserable limbo between one world and another. But then came the first meal service, and with it, the first crack in their expectations. American mess personnel appeared with metal trays and began distributing food. The women, weak from nausea and fear, barely noticed at first, but as the trays were set before them, they slowly comprehended what they were seeing. Bread, not the sawdust mixed grey brick they had choked down in Germany's final months, but real bread, white and soft, still faintly warm. Slabs of meat, actual meat, not horse or mystery protein, but recognizable beef. Potatoes, butter, coffee that smelled rich and dark when poured into tin cups. The women stared at these trays as if they were hallucinations. Surely this could not be real. Surely the Americans would not feed their prisoners better than the Reich had fed its own citizens. A girl from Cologne reached out with trembling fingers to touch the bread, half expecting it to dissolve like a dream. When it remained solid, warm, undeniably real under her hand, she began to cry. Others followed. Some wept silently, tears streaming down gaunt faces. Others sobbed openly, the sound raw and desperate. Not everyone accepted the food. Suspicion ran deep. Some insisted it must be poisoned, that this was an elaborate trick to kill them all without the mess of execution. They pushed their trays away, eyeing the food with deep distrust. But as hours passed and those who had eaten showed no signs of illness, the holdouts began to reconsider. Hunger is a powerful force, and they had been hungry for so very long. One by one they began to eat, tentatively at first, then with increasing desperation as their bodies remembered what real nourishment tasted like. The flavour was overwhelming. After years of deprivation, of meals that were barely sufficient to sustain life, the richness of butter, the substance of real meat, the sweetness of wheat flour hit their senses like a physical blow. Some could only manage a few bites before their shrunken stomachs rebelled. Others ate until they were sick, unable to stop even as their bodies protested. And with every bite came confusion, a cognitive dissonance that grew more unbearable with each meal. If the Americans were the monsters they had been told about, if captivity was supposed to mean degradation and starvation, then why this? Why food that was better than what their own families were eating in the ruins of Germany? Night after night, as the ship continued its westward journey, the women lay in their bunks and whispered to each other in the darkness. Some tried to maintain their hatred, clinging to it like a lifeline, insisting that this kindness was temporary, that the real horror would begin once they reached America. Others found their certainty eroding, worn away by each meal, each neutral interaction with guards who neither abused them nor befriended them, but simply treated them with professional indifference. The propaganda they had absorbed for years began to feel less solid, less absolute. Seeds of doubt took root in soil that had been watered by years of lies. When the coastline of America finally appeared on the horizon, the women crowded against portholes and onto the deck to see it. The sight that greeted them was incomprehensible. Cities rose clean and whole against the sky, their buildings intact, their windows gleaming with glass, their streets visible even from a distance, orderly and undamaged. There were no ruins here, no craters, no evidence of the devastation that war brings. The Statue of Liberty stood in the harbour, her torch raised, her face serene, a symbol of something these women had been taught to despise, but which now seemed almost mocking in its pristine grandeur. They were arriving defeated and broken into a land that showed no scars, a country that had somehow remained untouched while Europe tore itself apart. The docking process was orderly and efficient. The women were assembled on deck, counted once more, and marched down the gangplanks onto American soil. Some collapsed as soon as they set foot on solid ground, their legs no longer accustomed to surfaces that did not pitch and roll. Others stood frozen, staring at their surroundings with expressions of shock. The ports bustled with activity, workers moving cargo, vehicles rumbling past, the sounds and smells of a functioning society going about its business. It was utterly foreign, and yet somehow ordinary, this evidence of normalcy, of life continuing as if the world had not just spent years destroying itself. Crowds had gathered to watch the prisoners arrive. Some onlookers jeered, shouting insults in English that the women could not understand but whose tone was unmistakable. Others simply stared in silence, curious about these enemy women in their faded uniforms. A few held signs, though whether they were expressions of anger or something else, the prisoners could not tell. They kept their eyes down, trying to make themselves small, trying not to provoke whatever hostility might be waiting to unleash itself upon them. Buses arrived to transport them inland. The women climbed aboard, taking seats on vinyl benches, and watched through windows as the American landscape unfolded. The contrast with Germany was so stark it felt like a physical pain. Here were roads without bomb craters, bridges intact and functional, fields green and productive rather than scarred by trenches and littered with debris. They passed through small towns where houses stood complete with porches and gardens, where children played in yards, where shops displayed goods in their windows. The abundance was staggering. Every mile travelled drove home the realization of how thoroughly Germany had been defeated, how completely the war had destroyed everything they had known while leaving America not just intact, but thriving. As the buses rolled on, carrying them deeper into the American interior, the women began to understand the true measure of their situation. They were not simply prisoners of war. They were witnesses to the gulf between victor and vanquished, between a nation that had survived and a nation that had been reduced to rubble. The propaganda had prepared them for cruelty and degradation. It had not prepared them for this, for the psychological impact of seeing with their own eyes how much they had lost, how thoroughly their world had been unmade while another world continued, prosperous and whole. The camps themselves, when they finally arrived, were another shock to absorb. These were not the concentration camps the Reich had built, places of deliberate horror and industrialized death. These were prisoner-of-war facilities constructed according to international law, with guard towers and barbed wire fences, yes, but also with painted wooden barracks, swept pathways, and an orderliness that suggested structure rather than chaos, discipline rather than brutality. The women were processed through reception, their names recorded in ledgers, their photographs taken, numbered tags assigned to each one. The bureaucracy was meticulous but not cruel. Forms were filled out in triplicate. Medical examinations were conducted with clinical detachment. Possessions were inventoried and stored. And then they were led to the showers. This was the moment many had been dreading most. The rumours that had circulated during the war were specific and terrifying. Shower rooms, they had been told, were where the worst would happen. This was where the Americans would reveal their true nature, where dignity would be stripped away along with clothing, where humiliation would begin in earnest. The women filed into the long building in silence, their hearts hammering, some praying silently, others simply numb with dread. But when the water began to flow, it was hot, clean. The guards handed them bars of soap, real soap that lathered in their hands and smelled faintly of flowers. Towels were distributed, rough but functional. Shampoo was provided to wash hair that had been lice-ridden and filthy for months. The women stood under the streams of water, initially frozen in disbelief, and then slowly, hesitantly beginning to wash. The dirt of the journey, the accumulated grime of captivity and war, all of it sluiced away down the drains. And with the physical cleansing came an emotional upheaval that many could barely process. Some laughed, the sound nervous and almost hysterical, unable to reconcile this reality with what they had expected. Others wept, their tears mixing with the shower water, mourning something they could not quite name. A few simply stood motionless, letting the water pour over them, their minds struggling to integrate this experience with everything they had been taught to believe. When they emerged from the showers, wrapped in clean towels, their bodies scrubbed and their hair washed, they caught glimpses of themselves in fogged mirrors and barely recognized their own reflections. They looked almost human again, not the hollow-eyed spectres they had become during the Reich's collapse. That night, issued clean prison uniforms and assigned to bunks in the barracks, the women lay awake whispering to each other. One voice, trembling with confusion, said what many were thinking. "They gave us soap, real soap. Why would they do that?" Another answered, her tone bitter. "To make us grateful, to make us forget." But a third voice, quieter, more uncertain, said what no one wanted to acknowledge. Or perhaps they gave us soap because they see us as human beings who deserve basic dignity. That possibility was more frightening than cruelty would have been. Hatred was simple. Hatred made sense. You could cling to hatred, use it as armor against the enemy, let it sustain you through hardship. But kindness? Civility? These things were weapons against which they had no defense. These things required them to reconsider everything, to question the foundation of beliefs that had shaped their understanding of the world. And so, in the darkness, as guards walked their rounds outside and the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of night, the women wrestled with a new kind of captivity, one that imprisoned not their bodies, but their certainties. The days that followed established routines that became both comforting and disturbing in their normalcy. A bell rang each morning at dawn, its clear tone cutting through the cold air. The women rose from their bunks, dressed in the simple prison uniforms provided, and made their way to the mess hall for breakfast. And each morning brought the same disorienting experience, the sight and smell of food that defied everything they understood about captivity. Oatmeal served hot with brown sugar and milk. Bread rolls that were soft and fresh, not stale or mouldy. Butter, real butter that spread easily and tasted rich. Coffee that was strong and black, poured generously into cups that were refilled without question. Sometimes there were eggs, scrambled and steaming. Occasionally fruit, apples or oranges that seemed like impossible luxuries. The portions were not lavish, but they were adequate, more than adequate compared to what these women had survived on in Germany's final months. They ate mechanically at first, still half expecting the food to be taken away, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as days became weeks, the meals continued with predictable regularity. 3 times a day they were fed. The quality never diminished. The portions remained consistent, and slowly, inevitably, their bodies began to respond. Gaunt faces filled out. Prominent ribs became less visible. Hair that had been dull and brittle began to recover some of its sheen. They were gaining weight, growing healthier, their bodies recovering from years of malnutrition and stress. But this physical recovery came with a psychological cost that grew heavier with each passing day. Letters began to arrive from Germany, censored but still raw with desperation. The contents were harrowing. Families described living in basements of bombed buildings because the upper floors had been destroyed. Children wrote about being hungry all the time, about eating grass and boiling leather to make something resembling soup. Mothers begged for help, for food, for anything that might keep them alive through another winter. Brothers and fathers who had survived the fighting described conditions that were beyond dire. Cities where law and order had collapsed, where people fought over scraps, where disease was rampant and medicine non-existent. The women read these letters by candlelight in the barracks, and with each word their guilt deepened into something almost unbearable. Here they were, prisoners of war, supposedly suffering captivity, and yet they ate 3 meals a day. They slept in beds with clean sheets. They washed with soap and hot water. Meanwhile, their families, the ones who had remained loyal to Germany throughout the war, were literally starving. The injustice of it, the terrible irony, was crushing. Some stopped writing home altogether, unable to describe their reality to people who were experiencing such deprivation. How could they tell a starving mother that they had eaten beef stew? How could they confess to a brother scrounging for food that they had access to chocolate? The work assignments were another source of confusion. The women were divided into labour details based on their skills and the camp's needs. Some were assigned to kitchens, where they prepared meals not just for prisoners, but for American personnel as well. Others worked in laundries, washing uniforms and linens in industrial machines that were far more advanced than anything they had used in Germany. A few with clerical skills were put to work in administrative offices, typing reports and filing documents under supervision. Physical labour was assigned to those deemed fit enough, working in fields just outside the camp perimeter, harvesting crops or maintaining the grounds. For this work, they received small wages, not real American currency, but camp script, printed money that could only be used within the prisoner of war facility. The amounts were modest, but the fact that they received anything at all was bewildering. Prisoners doing forced labour for their captors, yet being paid for it. The contradiction defied logic. But the script was real, and it could be exchanged at the camp canteen for goods that seemed to come from another world entirely. The canteen was perhaps the most surreal aspect of their captivity. It was a small building near the centre of the camp, its shelves stocked with items that would not have been out of place in an American drugstore or general store. Chocolate bars wrapped in colourful paper, brands they had never heard of, but which tasted sweeter and richer than anything they remembered. Cigarettes for those who smoked, not the harsh ersatz tobacco of Germany's war years, but real American cigarettes. Toiletries, toothpaste and soap and shampoo, writing paper and pencils, and impossibly incredibly, lipstick. The first time a woman held up a tube of lipstick in the canteen, examining it with disbelief, others gathered around to stare. Lipstick. Bright red cosmetic that served no practical purpose whatsoever, that was purely decorative, purely for making oneself feel human and feminine. In Germany, such frivolities had disappeared years ago, melted down or repurposed or simply vanished as the war consumed everything. But here, in an American prison camp, enemy women could purchase lipstick with money earned from their labour. The absurdity of it was almost too much to bear. Some women refused to buy anything, insisting it was wrong to indulge when their families had nothing. Others could not resist their need for some small comfort, some tiny piece of normalcy overwhelming their guilt. A girl from Hamburg bought a Hershey bar and bit into it, the chocolate melting on her tongue, and immediately ran outside to vomit, overcome by the richness of it and the shame of enjoying something so luxurious while knowing her family was starving. Another woman bought lipstick, applied it carefully in front of a small mirror, and stared at her reflection with tears streaming down her face. "I look human," she whispered. "I look like a person again." But the words brought no comfort, only deeper confusion about what it meant to be human, to be a person, when the world had been turned so completely upside down. The guards remained professional and distant for the most part, neither friendly nor cruel. They enforced rules with consistency, but without particular harshness. Roll calls were conducted efficiently. Work details were supervised attentively, but not oppressively. Some guards clearly harboured resentment, their brothers or fathers or friends having died fighting Germans in Europe, and their eyes held a coldness that needed no words to communicate. But even these guards maintained discipline, never allowing personal feelings to translate into abuse or mistreatment. The Geneva Convention was followed meticulously, not out of kindness necessarily, but out of a commitment to international law and to the American image of itself as a nation that did things the right way, even in war. Occasionally, moments of unexpected humanity would break through the professional distance. A guard dropping his flashlight during evening roll call, a prisoner picking it up and handing it back, their eyes meeting briefly in a moment of simple human courtesy. A soldier humming a tune while walking past the laundry building, and a prisoner recognizing the melody and humming along without thinking, both of them pausing, startled by the shared moment. These small interactions were more destabilizing than cruelty would have been, because they reminded the women that the enemy was human too, that Americans were not the monsters described in propaganda, but ordinary people doing their jobs. Some prisoners were selected for supervised work details outside the camp, taken into nearby towns to provide labour for local businesses or municipal projects. These excursions provided the most jarring contrast of all. The women would ride in trucks through American streets, past houses with neat lawns and white picket fences, past shops with plate glass windows displaying goods in abundance, past children playing baseball in empty lots, past people living normal lives utterly untouched by war. They picked cotton in fields that stretched to the horizon, worked in canneries processing food that would feed Americans while their own people starved, raked leaves in public parks where families had picnics on sunny afternoons. The Americans they encountered during these work details regarded them with curiosity mostly, some hostility occasionally, but rarely with the vicious hatred they had been led to expect. Shop owners would sometimes offer them water on hot days. Housewives would occasionally bring sandwiches for the workers. Once, a child approached the fence where prisoners were working and offered an apple through the wire, smiling shyly, and the woman who accepted it stood there clutching the fruit and crying because the simple gesture of a child's kindness had broken something inside her. They saw prosperity everywhere they looked. Cars that were polished and functional, not rusting hulks stripped for parts. Roads that were paved and maintained, with painted lines and traffic signals that actually worked. Buildings that had roofs and windows and doors that closed properly. The abundance was incomprehensible. While Germany literally crumbled, while its people scavenged through ruins and fought over scraps, America seemed to have more of everything than it could possibly need. The stores had shelves stocked with goods. The restaurants had diners eating full meals. The gas stations had fuel. It was a functioning society, operating normally, as if there was no war at all in the parts of the world that mattered to Americans in their daily lives. At night, back in the barracks, the women would lie awake and try to process what they had seen. Conversations in the darkness circled endlessly around the same questions. How had Germany fallen so far? How had the Reich, which promised greatness and glory, delivered only devastation? How could the enemy nation be so wealthy, so intact, so apparently unconcerned with the destruction it had helped bring to Europe? And most troubling of all, what did it mean that they, loyal servants of the Third Reich, were being treated with more humanity by America than Germany had shown to its own people? The propaganda began to crumble under the weight of observable reality. Every meal chipped away at the narrative. Every bar of soap eroded certainty. Every moment of basic human dignity undermined years of indoctrination. Some women tried desperately to cling to their hatred, understanding on some level that without it, they would be left with nothing, no framework to make sense of their experience. But hatred is hard to maintain in the face of relentless civility. You cannot easily hate people who feed you, who provide medical care when you are ill, who treat you according to rules and laws rather than whims and cruelty. Diaries began to appear, women recording their thoughts in notebooks purchased from the canteen with their modest wages. One kept by Anna, a former secretary from Munich, contained entries that captured the growing internal conflict. The words were stark, stripped of pretense. "Hatred is easy to carry," she wrote. "It weighs nothing and asks nothing of you. But dignity, real human dignity, is a burden I was not prepared for. Every kindness cuts deeper than cruelty ever could, because cruelty would confirm what I was taught to believe. Kindness forces me to question everything." As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn colours they had never seen in Germany, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, the women settled into their strange captivity with a mixture of resignation and unease. They were not free, but neither were they truly suffering. They were not guests, but neither were they brutalized. They existed in a limbo between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to the one they had left, not permitted to join the one they inhabited. And in that limbo, fundamental questions took root and grew. Questions about loyalty and truth, about what they had believed and what they now knew, about who they had been and who they might become. Winter came, and with it, news that repatriation was being discussed. Names would be called, they were told. Ships would take them back to Europe, back to Germany, back to what remained of their homeland. The announcement should have brought relief, even joy. They should have been celebrating the prospect of going home, of seeing families again, of leaving behind this strange captivity. But when the news spread through the barracks, many women felt not elation but dread. To return to Germany meant to trade the abundance of captivity for the deprivation of freedom. It meant giving up regular meals for starvation, clean beds for makeshift shelters in ruins, soap and hot water for filth and cold. It meant facing families who had suffered unimaginably while they had been, relatively speaking, comfortable. It meant reconciling their experience with the experiences of those who had remained, finding words to explain the unexplainable, justifying their survival when so many others had not survived. Whispered conversations in the darkness took on a new character. "I'm afraid to go home," one woman confessed, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, shocking in their honesty. Others murmured agreement. They were afraid of the hunger, yes. But more than that, they were afraid of the questions, of the judgment, of having to explain why they looked healthy and well-fed when their families looked like skeletons. They were afraid of no longer fitting into the world they came from, of being changed in ways that could not be undone. The lists began to appear, names called during roll call, women instructed to prepare for departure. Some packed their few belongings with trembling hands, trying to feel grateful for the chance to leave but finding only anxiety. Others openly wept, not from happiness at the prospect of freedom, but from fear of what freedom would actually mean. A few even approached guards, asking quietly, desperately, if there was any way they could stay, could remain in America even as prisoners rather than return to Germany as free women in a land of ruins. The requests were denied, gently but firmly. The Geneva Convention was clear. Prisoners of war must be repatriated when hostilities cease. There were no exceptions, no matter how compelling the reasons might seem. The day of departure arrived wrapped in cold morning fog. Trucks were loaded with prisoners and their minimal luggage. Guards who had maintained professional distance for months showed small signs of something almost like regret, a nod of acknowledgement, a slight softening around the eyes. They had done their jobs, these American soldiers, treating enemy prisoners according to the rules of civilized warfare, and now those prisoners were leaving. Some of the guards recognized that they had witnessed something significant, a strange inversion where captivity had meant survival and freedom would mean hardship, though they could not fully understand the psychological turmoil their former prisoners carried with them. As the trucks pulled away from the camp, the women looked back through the rear windows at the place that had held them. The barracks where they had slept in clean beds, the mess hall where they had eaten more than they had in years, the canteen where they had purchased small luxuries, the fences that had marked the boundary of their captivity. And many felt tears on their faces, crying not because they had been imprisoned, but because they were being released, not because they had suffered, but because they had been treated like human beings by those they had been taught to see as less than human. The journey back across the Atlantic was the reverse of their arrival, but the women travelling it were not the same. Their bodies were stronger, healthier, their faces fuller, but their minds were changed in ways that went deeper than physical recovery. They had crossed an ocean expecting degradation and found dignity. They had braced for cruelty and encountered civility. They had prepared to hate and instead found themselves confused, conflicted, forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of their enemy and, by extension, about the nature of the cause they had served. When European shores finally appeared on the horizon, the sight brought no joy, only a sinking feeling of dread. The ports they docked at were barely recognizable, damaged and partially functional, operating at a fraction of their pre-war capacity. The process of disembarkation was chaotic compared to the orderly efficiency of American procedures. They were counted, their papers processed, and then released into a landscape that had been transformed by catastrophe. Many returned to cities they could not recognize. Streets they had known since childhood were now wastelands of rubble. Houses where they had grown up were gone, reduced to piles of brick and splintered wood. They searched for families among survivors who moved like ghosts through the ruins, thin and haggard and desperate. Reunions, when they occurred, were fraught with complicated emotions. Joy at seeing loved ones alive, yes, but also guilt so profound it was almost crippling. How do you embrace a starving mother when your own stomach is full? How do you kiss a brother who looks like a skeleton when your own face is rounded with health? How do you explain that you ate beef while they boiled grass? The questions came, as they knew they would. What was it like? Were you mistreated? Did they hurt you? And the women struggled to answer honestly. No, they would say. We were not mistreated. We were fed, we were given clean clothing, we were treated according to international law. But these truthful answers brought not relief, but confusion, and sometimes anger. How could the enemy have been kind? How could the Americans have fed German prisoners while Germans starved? The implications were too painful to fully confront. Some chose to lie, or at least to omit, to spare their families the knowledge of the gulf between captivity in America and survival in Germany. They described hardship that had not occurred, suffering they had not experienced, maintaining the narrative that everyone expected because the truth was too complicated, too uncomfortable. Others tried to be honest and found themselves met with disbelief or resentment. You were lucky, people would say bitterly. You got to escape while we endured. And perhaps there was truth in that, though luck is a strange word to apply to imprisonment in a foreign land. The women carried their experiences with them like invisible scars. They had witnessed two worlds, one destroyed and one intact, and the contrast had shown them truths about both that could not be unlearned. Germany, the homeland they had served, had demanded everything from them and given back mostly death and destruction. America, the hated enemy, had asked nothing and provided basic human dignity even to those who had worked against it. This inversion of expectations had consequences that lasted far beyond the war, shaping how these women understood loyalty and truth, justice and power, propaganda and reality. In the years that followed, as Germany slowly began to rebuild, the former prisoners carried their secrets and their knowledge. Some spoke openly about their experiences, trying to help others understand the complexity of what they had lived through. Most remained quiet, finding that the truth of their captivity was too nuanced for a society trying to come to terms with devastation and defeat. It was easier to maintain simple narratives, to cast clear heroes and villains, than to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the enemy shows you more humanity than your own side ever did. But the memory persisted, the memory of hot showers and bars of soap, the taste of real bread after years of sawdust substitutes, the sight of abundance in the midst of captivity, the strange kindness of guards who could have been cruel but chose professionalism instead, the realization that the world was more complicated than propaganda had allowed, that people were more nuanced than ideology permitted, that even in the darkest times, choices could be made about how to treat those in your power. These memories became a kind of testimony, not widely shared perhaps, but no less significant for their relative silence. They spoke to a truth that transcended the simple story of Allied victory and Axis defeat. They revealed that wars are fought not just with weapons, but with values, that how you treat your enemies says as much about you as how you treat your allies, that mercy can be a more powerful force than vengeance, that dignity offered even to those who do not deserve it can accomplish what cruelty never could. The women who lived this experience carried it to their graves, most of them. A few wrote memoirs or gave interviews in their later years, trying to capture something of what it had meant to be treated as human by those you expected to be monsters, trying to explain the psychological impact of kindness in a context of enmity. But words could never fully convey the complexity of it, the way each meal had been both nourishment and accusation, the way each clean sheet had been both comfort and indictment, the way each moment of basic dignity had undermined years of carefully constructed certainty. Their story remains one of war's stranger chapters, often overlooked in favour of more dramatic narratives of combat and heroism. But it speaks to something profound about the human capacity for restraint even in victory, about the power of maintaining standards even when it would be easier to abandon them, about the long-term consequences of choosing civilization over barbarity. The Americans who ran those camps were not saints. They had their own prejudices and resentments, their own reasons for wanting revenge. But they chose to follow rules instead of impulses, to uphold laws instead of indulging hatred, and in doing so they demonstrated that even in war, especially in war, how we treat those in our power defines who we are more clearly than any battlefield victory ever could. For the German women who experienced this treatment, the impact was profound and lasting. They had boarded ships expecting hell and found something far more confusing, far more challenging to their understanding of the world. They had been prepared to hate, to resist, to die if necessary rather than submit. But soap and bread and simple human decency had disarmed them more effectively than any weapon could have. They had learned that the world was not as simple as they had been taught, that enemies could show mercy, that kindness could come from unexpected sources, that the truth was always more complicated than propaganda allowed. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that the softest gestures can sometimes cut the deepest, that mercy can wound more profoundly than cruelty, that being treated with dignity when you expect degradation can shake the foundations of belief more effectively than any amount of suffering. A bar of soap, a hot meal, a clean bed, these simple things became weapons in a war of ideas, challenging everything these women thought they knew about themselves and their world. In the end, their story stands as testament to the power of maintaining humanity, even in the midst of inhumanity, of choosing restraint when vengeance would be easier, of recognizing that how we treat even our enemies reflects not on them, but on ourselves. The German women who spent the war's final months in American captivity learned this lesson in the most personal way possible, through the daily accumulation of small mercies that added up to a fundamental shift in understanding. And though many struggled with that knowledge, though some resented it and others were grateful for it, all were changed by it in ways that could never be undone. Their captivity ended when they returned to Germany, but the real prison, the one constructed of certainty and hatred and propaganda, had already been unlocked by the simple act of being treated as human beings deserving of basic dignity. That freedom, uncomfortable and confusing as it was, proved more lasting and more significant than any physical imprisonment could ever be. It was the freedom to question, to doubt, to see complexity where simplicity had been enforced, to understand that the world refuses to fit into the neat categories that ideology demands. And so their story endures, not as a tale of suffering overcome or hardship endured, but as something stranger and more subtle. A story of how kindness can be more powerful than cruelty, how dignity can undermine hatred, how the simplest gestures toward humanity can accomplish what force never could. It is a story that challenges us to consider how we treat those in our power, whether in war or peace, whether enemies or friends, whether deserving or not. Because in the end, those choices define us more clearly than any declaration or ideology ever could, revealing in our treatment of others the truth of who we really are.